Good afternoon, everyone, and good day, and welcome to what is now number 6 in our Data Matters virtual live streams. It's another beautiful sunny day in lockdown here in the UK. And this week, Steve Wright. Give us a wave, Steve.
Good afternoon, good morning, and hello.
Thank you, Steve. And myself have some special guests here. We're joined by Temi Akindele. Can Temi give us a wave?
Hello.
There's Temi. Temi is Data Protection and Legal Counsel at the Prince's Trust. And also joining us today is Anthony Lee. Hi, Anthony.
Hi there.
Anthony is Head of Commercial and IP, Technology and Media and Partner at Rosenblatt. Anthony and Temi will actually be talking directly with Steve today on the topic of accountability, providing their expert views. Now, often holding someone to account is considered to be something in the negative, but actually, if you understand what you're accountable for and to whom, it can put you in a much more comfortable position. You're easily or more easily able to demonstrate compliance. And you can feel confident, at least, that you know that your controls are operating and that your risks are being managed adequately. Of course, without all of this, you're going to struggle to be able to report to your board, to your executive, and confirm that your position is defensible, and more importantly, be able to demonstrate that to your regulator. So in the first of this 12-part series, I'm now going to hand over to Steve to begin the discussion. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you. Well, look, it is a wonderful sunny day out there, so I know that many of you will be contemplating getting out there. So we're going to whiz through this topic. It's an interesting topic, and I you know, all of these subjects are so timely with the current COVID virus causing the authorities to look at alternative ways and challenging ways to collect the data and hopefully to help form part of the strategy to release, if you like, to take us out of lockdown and to gradually release us back into so we can meet up and get back to work. And the underlying principle around that is obviously, you know, privacy, and this is causing much debate in the privacy circles. What, you know, what's the ethical question and what's right, and do we infringe on our liberties? And I am absolutely delighted this week to introduce two very special guests whom are actually on the front line of this very subject. But we're not going to just focus on that. We're actually here to talk, as Vicky quite rightly said, about accountability. What is it? What does it mean? How does it work? I think I'll start by, I mean, let me give you my sort of 2 pence worth. For me, accountability, as Vicky was alluding to, is about attitude, is about culture, as well as the sort of practical side of how you set that up in terms of governance and risk and making sure the key components or minimum components that you would expect to see in any sort of compliance regime. But I'm gonna leave it to these fantastic experts who are actually in the roles as we speak and out there. If I go, first of all, I'm going to pick on Temi. Temi, do you want to give us your thoughts on just what you think accountability means to you as a DPO? What does it mean in your organisation? What does it mean to you? What's your sort of definition, if you like? And then I'll come over to Anthony.
Thank you, Steve. I believe accountability as a principle under GDPR is about you as an organization owning your implementation of the regulations. It's quite clear in the principles that it's one of the principles is that you have to be able to demonstrate compliance. And it's for me, it's about the responsibility of you actually saying, we know this regulation, we know what it says, but this is how we've translated it in our organization, and this is how we're able to check and to make sure that we are complying with what the regulation expects of us. It is an obligation, and yes, we have to do it, but we have made it our own. So it's ours to show you how well we're doing, pretty much.
No, that's great. I mean, you ticked all the boxes there. Yeah, you talked about demonstrating compliance. You talked about responsibility, the sort of the checking and the owning. And the big thing for me, certainly when I was DPO, was about getting people to understand their responsibilities and how they can own this challenge. But let's hear it from our leading lawyer perspective. Anthony, what's your thoughts on the definitions of accountability?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And really, just to echo and reinforce what Temi said, I mean, it features in many places in the regulation, primarily as one of the key principles, and that is, as Temi said, about taking responsibility or being ownership of the need to comply with the regulation, and particularly the 6 core principles and all the detail that sits around that. And secondly, being able to prove it, being able to demonstrate it, being able to evidence it, being able to show the technical and organisational measures that has been taken by that organisation, that business, to comply with the requirements of the regulation.
And I mean, this, you know, do you think, my question is, you know, I remember at the beginning, 4 or 5 years ago, when we were looking at GDPR, and we were all, well, many of us were privileged enough to see some released draft text. So we kind of knew what was coming downstream, and we were able to adapt our policies and our privacy programs accordingly. But I do remember having sort of quite a few good, healthy discussions with the ICO and the Dutch regulator on about what the value was of all of this. You know, why, you know, what they were talking about, ROIs and you know, adding value to the company. I said, but the trouble with all of this, which you've both alluded to, is this is costly, right? It takes time to demonstrate compliance. You have to employ people with specialist skills, specialist knowledge. You have to educate your third line support, your audit teams, etc. And you know, there is a question that I've got for either of you, which is this really good for you know, for the UK or for any organisation or business around the world that comes within the scope of GDPR? Is it actually good for us, either as a company or as an individual? So who wants to tackle that thorny?
I can start if that's okay.
Go ahead, Temi.
So I think it's great. I'm a strong believer of accountability in anything you do. And obviously, with the way the world is changing now, we are moving a lot more of our lives to being online, you know. So on the one side, people say things like, oh, people give their data for free, but on the other hand, people trust that they're giving you that data and you're doing something with it. So even when they don't ask you, or they don't know to ask you to kind of say, why do you want my data? What are you doing with it? There is still that inherent trust in them giving it to you. So they actually believe that they've given it to you and you will take good care of it, which is why when things don't go right, there is that mistrust that you get from the public or from people who kind of say, oh, well, you had my data, you did this wrong with it, you know. So I think it's great. I think we've moved now from a position where it was a more reactive approach, where people were just collecting data, doing what they wanted to do with it, and would only worry when something went wrong, to a more proactive attitude to it, where to think, before I ask someone for their data, I need to know why I'm asking for it. I need to be able to show that I've thought through the reason why I want that data, what I'm going to do with it. I have literally I've done a PIA, I've assessed the privacy implications, I've considered how intrusive or non-intrusive this is for the person. And even if the person hasn't demanded that of me, I have done all that work in the background to ensure that I can safely collect, hold, transmit, process their data. So I think it's fantastic for businesses. I think people need to stop seeing it as a burden. I appreciate that it is time consuming, it is resource intensive, but the result of endearing the trust, the confidence you inspire in the work you've done, as an organization and the trust that people will have in you, I think that's the return on investment, if I could, use it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Anthony, what's your, you must be working, no doubt, with lots of organizations. What's your thoughts on that? Is it a good or bad thing?
Well, I mean, first of all, the principle of accountability, now informs every aspect of the regulation, whether you're looking at a specific principle or looking at a specific requirement around privacy impact assessments. It informs everything. The need to be proactive, the need to evidence the steps you've taken. It's a real game changer. And the fact that the regulation does have some sharp teeth on it through the enforcement regime, it's there, has to be acknowledged. As to whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think certainly from the perspective of an individual, a data subject, has to be a good thing that organisations can be held to account for playing fast and loose with your data, primarily through the ICO or the applicable supervisory authority potential damages claims. From the organisational perspective, yes, it is a regulatory burden, and particularly for an organisation that's in a highly regulated sector, may see it as yet another regulatory risk that they need to address. But really, again, as Temi says, it has and will continue to force organisations, small to large, to get a real handle on the data for which they're responsible, and to comply with the regulation and to be seen to comply with the regulation. And that does have its plus side. Obviously, it means you're less likely to be fined or to be sanctioned or to be sued. But the flip side of that coin is you're less likely to suffer reputational risk, particularly if you're a consumer-facing organisation. We've all seen the cautionary tales out there where there's been a huge data leak. It's a consumer-facing organisation, and it hasn't done too much good to their share price. So, the positives are that it's inevitably, ultimately, a good thing for organisations to be on top of the data for which they have taken responsibility.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant and interesting, because what was coming through loud and clear there was about the proactive nature, the fact that it's turned organisations, it's almost switched the switch so that these organisations are now feeling more accountable, because they're, there's this looming threat of potential sanctions or getting your knuckles rapped if you were caught doing the wrong thing with data. But I wonder what the individual thinks of all of this, because, leading up to GDPR, we had a mad rush for consent where everyone was going out there and, as many of my colleagues at the time were saying, there's consent fatigue setting in, because I'm so bored of being asked, yes, I want to log in, yes, I want you to remember. And as for cookies, don't get me started. Well, I just want to, I'm trying to unpick what it is that this regulation and subsequent laws really does for us as an individual. What how am I better off from this? I'm a consumer, I'm an individual, I'm on countless databases around the world. How do I benefit from this? Temi, give me your thoughts from Prince's Trust.
So I think you are very right. So we started the whole process. We had a lot of people asking for consent. You had emails going through. I personally was exhausted and overwhelmed, with the number of consent emails I had. I remember I had a particular organization calling me and saying to me, oh, we've emailed you to get your consent, but you haven't replied. And I said, actually, the fact that I haven't replied is itself consent, is saying I haven't given my consent. So I think that answer is right there. So I do appreciate what you're saying. But I think it still goes back to what I said earlier about that confidence being built in the organization. So So you've still got people know more about their rights.
I see you got your kids with us, and
Yes.
do you want to introduce your child?
So he's run off now.
Oh, okay.
Run off now.
This is happening for all of us in our new days of work, so don't worry, keep going. You're being very professional.
So what I was saying, so I think at the time GDPR started, it also informed the public. So people knew they had these rights that they could exercise. They didn't necessarily know why they were exercising them, but they knew they could exercise them. And just the fact that people knew that actually I can't do this in itself meant that they wanted reassurance from companies and organizations that their data was being handled properly. So you'd have people who would just maybe read a news article and find out, oh, actually I can request data, I can ask this, I can ask that, I can ask that, and then they ask you those questions. But what I think most individuals were expecting from people and from companies when they asked those questions was an assurance that you are doing what the news is telling them you're supposed to be doing. So that in itself is a good thing. Now, I think it will lower a bit. You won't have as much contact from the individuals as time goes on. But I fear that as things happen, when something goes wrong again, when something is in the news, when the radar is put on a particular organization, a particular company, or a particular charity, anything, then people would actually again remember that actually we can do this, we can put questions to this, we can put questions to these companies, put questions to this charity, so they will exercise those rights again. And it's a case of, we don't know when something will go wrong. You don't want to wait till something goes wrong before you can put your ducks in a row. So have your ducks in a row constantly all the time. So when you're picked up on it, you can defend your position.
Thank you. That's good. Anthony, have you got anything from an individual? How do you feel? Do you feel protected now? Do you feel like your rights are enshrined? And I assume you're not receiving any more spam or any other unsolicited marketing as a result of this. I'm leading the witness. Sorry.
Yeah, putting my hat on as a data subject in my own right, I think, yes, I do feel more empowered. I do feel as if organisations will take privacy much more seriously, for the negatives as well as the positives, that they know if they don't, they can be called to account and sanctioned. Let's face up to that, and possibly sued as well. So yes, I do feel more empowered. I think everyone had a bit of GDPR fatigue in the run-up to the regulation kicking in. But yes, I think that and the principles of transparency, which we're not here to talk about today, but the requirement for organisations to keep people informed as to what data they got on them, privacy notices and the like. I think people do feel in a better place than they were under the old regime, for sure.
Thanks. No, that's really good, and I think the word empowered is actually a great, example of that. It did change for all of us as consumers, as well as employees, and that is definitely a good thing. I'd be interested to know from each of your perspectives about the sort of problems associated with this, because here we are talking about what accountability is and what it means, but what are you seeing as a DPO, and what are you seeing as a leading lawyer in this space? What are the challenges that both of you are finding in sort of associated with fulfilling these obligations? Is there one specific thing, or is it just the whole lot? What's your thoughts?
Okay, so I think with me, what I've seen in terms of the challenges, there's been commonalities, like things like maybe you have people who've been doing something a certain way all the while, and they just feel like GDPR is stopping what they're supposed to be doing, or they feel like they suddenly can't do what they were doing before because, GDPR could mean that it's not GDPR compliance. And what I find I always have to say is GDPR is not a person who's going to come and slap you on the head. it's a way of working. It's some of the things you're already doing are already compliant. You just need to, demonstrate or show in some way that you just need to know why you're doing what you're doing. Anthony says, it's about transparency, which we're not talking about that today, but it's about being transparent with why you're collecting data. So if, for instance, if I ask someone who comes to me for advice and I say, okay, why are you collecting that data? If they can't explain it to me, then it tells me they don't understand what they're doing with it. And for me, it raises a bigger problem of actually, should you be doing that with data then? Because if you can't explain to me what you want to do with that personal data, it's possibly likely you don't need to be processing it. So there's that understanding in the first instance. Then, one of the things about accountability is having contracts in place, the checks you need to do with any parties you're sharing with. With GDPR starting, obviously we're getting lots of organizations were writing each other and saying to each other, even the same way individuals were getting the emails, companies were writing to each other, organizations writing to each other to say, demonstrate to me that you are compliant, you're doing what you need to do. So having to go through all those checklists, making sure, and obviously asking for the same information from other organizations as well, was quite labor intensive, but I know it had to be done. But now that we're in a slightly more settled position, I still find that you still have the odd person who will send you a contract and you're thinking, actually, did you not think to have updated that with the relevant GDPR provisions? So you have a processor who wants to do work for you, and in that contract they've said, oh, we're going to do this, they're going to, they quoted the wrong legislation. So there's still a bit here and there where needs tying up. And then there's also the challenge of actually making it work for your organization, because obviously it's about, like I said earlier, it's about understanding why you're processing that data. But sometimes the identifying the legal basis. So we talked about consent earlier. So some people just want to default naturally to consent. I'm thinking, actually, that's not true, proper consent. It's not fairly given. You're not going to do what you're saying you want to do with that. So why are you relying on consent? And they go, oh, we thought GDPR means you have to have consent for everything. Actually, no, you could explore other legal bases, but you need to know what you want to do with that information to explore those legal bases. So those are things I've seen since the implementation of GDPR.
No, that's thank you. That was really good. And Anthony, have you got any thoughts to add to that?
There's sort of a specific things and a few general things where the challenges that organisations face. So I guess one of them is, we mentioned earlier about GDPR fatigue, and there was a sense that when it kicked in, you did have organisations. The view was, well, we've done GDPR, that's it now. Like Y2K, we don't need to revisit that. And COVID-19 pandemic will show that you can't just sort of the status quo. You've got to adjust how you operate depending on the circumstances in which you find yourself. Other things I've found is it's not great if an organisation has a slightly siloed approach. It really does need the leadership of the organisation to own it, and then to bring on board the rest of the organisation through awareness raising and education. That needs to be kept fresh. It needs to be more than just doing an online course when you join and then a refresher every 6 months or so. So that sort of thing I think needs to be taken on board. No one's saying it's an easy job. There's quite a lot of detail in there that organisations need to keep on top of. There's that. I remember having one chat with an in-house lawyer who also had sort of privacy responsibilities within that organisation, saying, it's the job of the advisors to simplify things and show them what they actually need to do, rather than tell them what the risks are, actually how to fix it. So there is a sense that organisations need to be systematic in the way in which they address these issues and the resources that they allocate to it. A lot of it's down to common sense, but it's not an easy thing to do, that's for sure.
Anthony, Temi, that was great, and I think I've made some notes of some of the things that you were talking about in terms of those problems associated with accountability, and I particularly there's two things three in fact that really come out to me. One was about this siloed approach, which I think is a good point to mention. The other was about what Temi said about the legal understanding, what's the lawful basis by which you're processing. So that's a constant challenge, with new contracts, new ways of using the data. I mean, look at the situation we find ourselves in at the moment about how we use the mobile tracking technology. And I also think that what you touched on was around, which I liked, was around there is no status quo. And I think you mentioned it nicely, Anthony, by saying that, we all thought it was Y2K, or some people did. Yes. And there was this, load of activity, and then post GDPR, everyone going, oh, we can breathe easy now, let's just take it easy. But we all know, as DPOs and as lawyers advising or in counsel, in-house lawyers advising the businesses that we work in, that it's not, there is no rest. What would you say, because we're wrapping up now, but what would you say were the sort of things that you've noticed in your journeys, and we've all been on them, that is good? What do you think good looks like? How does that manifest itself? Temi, go ahead. You what's your thought?
What does good look like?
Yeah.
But I think, like I said already, good will in some way vary from one place to the other, depending on the organization, the type of data being processed, the maturity of the data protection team or resource that they have. But as a minimum, I think the IC has great resources. So as a minimum, every organization should have policies in place, like Anthony said, and it shouldn't be policies that we shouldn't just do an e-learning and a refresher, but we should actually find a way to live and breathe those policies in the day-to-day business. So those policies should touch on the business processes, and they need to be the people who are looking at these policies, people who are closest to that data, should have a basic understanding of what they should do with that data. I think that's what good looks like. I think you just writing a policy as a DPO and knowing what should happen, but your people not knowing, is not good.
Yeah.
So I think exactly. I think good, and I think it also touches on what Anthony said about working in silos. We don't work in silos as DPOs. We work with a team of people across the organization.
Yeah,
and you have people of varying understanding of data protection. You have people who have no clue about it, but you have people who've worked with it somewhere else and done something different with it, but they're struggling to understand how it applies in your current situation. So good would be getting everyone on board on the same page as a start.
That's an absolutely brilliant start. I think that's crucial. That's why Vicky and I created Privacy Culture, to harness that and get everyone on the same page to help us as DPOs. Yeah. Anthony, what's your thoughts? You've got a vast experience in this space. What do you think good looks like? What have you seen across your multiple clients?
Yeah, but I think again, it's if the ICO or the supervisory authority comes knocking on your door, either because of a complaint or on spec, they can do that under their investigatory powers. Just ask you what you're doing about this, that, and the other. That you're in a position to show that you've been proactive, that you've been organised, that you thought about the issues as they apply to your business, and you sought to address them. And you can only apply what resources are reasonable to the business. So to give a specific example, if you're an organisation that shares a lot of data with third-party processors, you use the cloud a lot. You want to, and there's a leak through the cloud. And there's an investigation or an inquiry from the ICO as a result of that. To Temi's point, you want to be able to demonstrate that you had a lawful basis for sharing the data with the third parties in question in the first place. And it might not be consent. There are lots of other things that you can think about there. That you satisfied yourself that the third party question had its ducks lined up, particularly from a security perspective, and the third parties upon which it relies, because in the cloud there's quite a long tail on the supply chain. And last but not least, I'm bound to say that because I'm a lawyer, that you've got the contract aligned to the specific requirements of the regulation, which are set out in Article 28. So it's it's looking at things that are relevant to your business, of particular relevance to your business, and being able to put yourself, as Vicky said at the very beginning, in a defensible position. So yeah, that would probably be the semi-uplands.
So timely, because I think Vicky may actually have some questions coming from our audience. And before I hand over to my partner, just want to warn Temi and Anthony that we're going to be asking them, their top tips before we close off on this session. But let me go hand over to my partner, who's got some questions from the audience. Vicky, over to you.
Thank you. Well, fantastic discussion. Really, really good. And, I'm just going back to the beginning. Both Temi and Anthony were talking about owning your implementation, taking responsibility for its translation into the organisation, being really transparent, and then trying to overcome certain challenges, for example, whereby, as Steve mentioned again, the organisation siloed, and perhaps people were used to doing things in a certain way and felt that potentially the regulation might hinder them in doing that. And somebody's actually come in with a question, and I think we've started to answer that, and I think the short answer is probably yes, but I'd be interested to hear from all of you what you think. Therefore, is accountability for data being made more difficult in this lockdown environment?
Ooh. Who wants to deal with that one?
Interestingly, when we were locked down, or when as a country we were preparing to lock down, one of the first things that occurred to me was we do need to drone in on the issue of accountability across the organization. So it was a case of we will have to do things differently. That's understandable. We will have to turn around some things quicker, or some things will have to take a back seat. But the bottom line is we still have to make sure we follow our due process. So, for instance, contracts that we had in place that we had to consider doing things slightly different, where we're going back to see if we can amend the contracts specifically to accommodate how we would have to work now. We're looking at things like, okay, how are we transporting data securely? Are we having, one of the first things as well we did was, you have to think about people are going to be working very differently, so they have to remember that you're still accountable. Fine, the ICO won't come knocking on our doors in this period, but when everything is settled, when the dust is settled, everything we did in the lead up to the lockdown will matter, because it will matter with how we then deal with things in the lockdown and how we go back to doing things after we get back to normal. So it is more challenging. It's not, I won't say it's not doable, it's challenging, but if you are already, factoring all of those things in and doing some of the basic things before, then you can continue to demonstrate accountability one way or the other.
Great point, thanks Temi. And Anthony, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, it is just an example of how circumstances can change. I don't think anyone expected such a drastic change in global circumstances, but how circumstances can change, and how as an organisation you respond to that. And accountability doesn't go away as a principle. You, in a sense, you need to be able to demonstrate you've done something. It may be that there's particular vulnerabilities on account of the fact that you as an organisation are all working remotely, and indeed your suppliers are as well, would be a good example, and how you've addressed that. I mean, I think the real challenge is it's more difficult to allocate resource to things when you're, you may be in a company where a lot of people are being put on furlough, so you're going to have some inevitable resource constraints on that. So I think in that sense alone, it makes being able to comply with any of the regulation, including the accountability, is made more difficult in these circumstances. But you still need to comply as best you can.
Absolutely, and that is essentially, as you're both saying, that's the bottom line. You know, we still need to be able to demonstrate compliance within the constraints that we're in, facing into these challenges. Steve, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we look to get top tips from Temi and Anthony?
Well, last time I said no to you. Yeah, you did that. I got into trouble, if you recall. So I think, look, for me, I'm not answering it, but I think certainly our audience probably want to hear from these guys a lot more than listening to me. So I'm going to fast forward to the top tips, because I think really one thing that did occur to me, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do this live broadcast, is because it's really hard and it can be quite lonely. And I think that what Temi's quite rightly said is that, you know, it's challenging because your resources are unavailable, but it's also can be a lonely post even when we were in the office, because you've got to make some tough decisions, and it's not like, you know, it's not as easy to go to someone and get their opinion. So I think the more we can offer to fellow DPOs, CISOs, or anyone with responsibility for data protection, the better. But yeah, let me hand it back to you and the top tips from our esteemed guests.
Well, top tip. I'd like to say, I want to sing now, but I can't. We're all in this together. I know it's something we're saying a lot now in this pandemic, but it is true. Even as privacy professionals, as data protection officers, anyone who's involved in this as a practitioner, we all have similar challenges. And so we are all in this together. And like Steve said, sometimes it can feel lonely because you do, in some structures, there's no department, it's just the one person who is the team. In some places, you've got a team of people to work with. And in other places, it's a mix where you've got a centralized team, but you've got people involved in different parts of the organization. But I think the main thing to remember is we're all in this together. We're all going through the same challenges. We're all facing the same concerns. And I find that sometimes just talking out loud to even someone who's not in my field, just repeating what's in my head helps me out, because then I'm like, right now I'm going to talk at you, but in hearing my words, then I know that I'm not going crazy thinking this thought. So I do that a lot. And I also think we are very fortunate as privacy professionals to have a community that is very, very supportive. So we have resources like what you guys are doing, Privacy Culture. You send emails weekly and just talking about things that are going on, things beyond the horizon. So I read those emails and I think, oh, actually, yeah, I was going to do that, but actually you raised it for me now. So I know what's going on. I don't need to do any research at the moment, but if I need to do, I'll come back to that. And then just being able to just reach out to colleagues in similar industries or in different industries. You don't have to tell them what the problem is or give the example, as you know, but you can share the concerns and just kind of pick each other's brains on how best to solve a problem. So the bottom line is we are all in this together, and we have to remember that no matter what.
Yeah, it's so true. The amount of times, Temi, we've met for coffees and things like that over the years, and it is obviously a bit difficult at the moment to have a coffee, but virtual coffees are the name of the game. And sorry, so what about yourself, Anthony? What's your just?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense, and the DPO, the privacy officers within an organisation are going to be critical to this, but the sense that whether you're in the midst of a global pandemic or post-lockdown world, the sense that this needs to be something that's the board, the leadership of an organisation takes ownership of and brings everyone along the journey with them. And then that's kind of critical. It won't work without that. And I'd say the second one is, which obviously resonates with your organisation, Steve and Vicky, but the need to embed privacy culture within the organisation through the awareness raising, through the education. So that sort of has to be the ongoing approach there. The third thing, I guess I'm bound to say this, given that I advise a lot of clients who use third-party resources to handle their data. But my personal view, and where we've always seen the big sanctions, albeit primarily under the old regime, but coming through under the new regime, the big exposure that most organisations have is to security, loss of data through security breach, and that can be as much a people thing as a technology thing. But that's where the big fines have always been, and I think the big fines always will be. So if you need to, one area to always keep the spotlight on is getting your ducks lined up in relation to the way in which you engage with third-party resources. I won't go over the things that I touched on before. And actually what goes into the contract is just a part of that. I know I'm kind of slightly doing myself out of a bit of work there as a lawyer, but it's more than just what goes into the contract with those suppliers. So that would be, for me, I guess, a bit of an obsession, but I think that's an area where we will continue to see organisations having a lot of exposure.
Fantastic. Some really, really great advice. Really enjoyed having both of you here with us today, and I'm sure the audience did as well. We are all in this together, as Temi says, and I feel like as much as we've learned from both of you, that we've had a bit of a virtual hug at the same time.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Feeling the love, Vicky. Feeling the love.
Feeling the love. And so picking up on kind of Anthony's point as well on the awareness and the security piece, the awareness and training piece is one area that we can all give a lot more focus to now. I think people seem to be really receptive to virtual training for exactly the same reason that Temi mentioned, because they want to feel included. And when you're all on a call, on a webinar together, and you can ask questions and you all feel as if you're kind of in the same virtual room and having a learning experience, it's good for people, and it means that you're educating them and continuing to raise awareness of these important topics as well. So I think that's a great thing to do. So we will now let you get back to your Friday. Next week we're going to be focusing on a very current topic, data subject rights, and we're very pleased to have Matthew Kay joining us. He's the DPO of Thomson Reuters. So don't miss that here with Data Matters next Friday at 2 p.m. And also don't forget to join in PrivSec's Last Thursday in Privacy, an online conference that's running next Thursday, the 30th of April. Steve and myself will be participating, so hopefully look forward to seeing you there. Have a lovely weekend and see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.